You're funny.
Did you bring plates? Okay, they don't. I do.
Yeah, I know. It's true. It's quite exciting.
Yeah, when he's laid out.
I'm gonna put it all back together.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you all for coming to support your Orcas Island Historical Museum. It's great to see you all here, and what a great kickoff for Journey Stories. So thank you for coming, and hope you've been having an enjoyable evening. I want to say that last year, let's say in October, November, we at the museum board were kind of thinking, well, what should we do next year? Maybe we'll get some things out of the archives and our artifacts storage, and we'll put out some kind of display. But then our vice president at the time, Idri Vincent, saw this little blurb about applying for Journey Stories from the Smithsonian Institution. And she put in an application for us, and lo and behold, we were selected as one of 6 in the state of Washington. And so then we knew what we'd be doing this summer, we'd be doing Journey Stories. But then and I want to say to our visitors from the Smithsonian, as I so often say to visitors from Orcas Island, that for a community of 4,500 people, there's just a tremendous amount of talent and diversity and willing givers on this island that you would not find in a community of 4,500. And Bill and Valerie Anders are 2 of those kind of people. And as the winter wound on, we came to understand that it was going to be just more than just putting on Journey Stories like the other 5 museums are doing. That we came to understand that Valerie was the national board member of the Smithsonian, as it happens, and with the incredible generosity of the Anders Foundation and the incredible energy of Valerie Anders, it's made it far, far more, especially for our museum, than it would otherwise have been. And you may again give them a big hand for all the proceeds of this evening going to the museum. So actually, to make the introduction of the Anders, I'm going to call upon one of our Smithsonian visitors, and I'm so happy to have you all here. It's something I don't think any of the other 5 museums are going to get to do this. So anyway, I'd like to welcome Anna Kahn. She's the director of the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service, or SITES. And this is the oldest and largest traveling exhibition service in the United States. And at some of the shows that I've been to highlighting journey stories, I say to the people, okay, how many of you have visited the Smithsonian? And about 2/3 of the hands go up, and how many have not, the other third. And I say, that's why we have these traveling exhibitions. Not everybody has the opportunity to make it to Washington, D.C. and see this, and that's what SITES does for us. So their mission is to share the wealth of the Smithsonian resources with as broad an audience as possible. They've been in business for just about the same time as our museum has, 58 years. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Anna Kahn for the introduction of the Anders.
Bill, thank you so much. And could we, before the evening, this part of the evening gets underway, have a huge shout out for this wonderfully elegant evening. It is one of the most special museum or exhibit openings that I think we've ever been to. And we know that a committee has been very hard at work on it. So we thank you very much. Bill, you stole my thunder and covered much of the ground that I wanted to, but I want to say on behalf of the Smithsonian and Humanities Washington, our partner on the Journey Stories exhibition, I and my colleagues from the Smithsonian who are here, and they are over there, if they can just give a wave out, Aoife Toomey and Jennifer O'Keefe. We are delighted not only to be on Orcas Island, which is the most splendid place on planet Earth, but to be able, it really is, but to be able to take part in the festivities that are leading to the opening 1 week from today at the Orcas Island Historical Museum of Journey Stories. Journey Stories is one of the exhibitions in our Museum on Main Street program, fondly known under the acronym of MOMS. And Museum on Main Street was created specifically for remote location communities. They're exhibitions that are small enough to be accommodated into non-traditional spaces or into historical societies or museums or libraries, but they are accompanied by communities whose spirit and substance sometimes brings an energy that outrivals the content of the exhibition itself. And I think Orcas Island is a splendid example of that. So we congratulate the whole island and the museum. Also, Bill referenced the fact that Orcas Island is one of only 6 communities on the MOMS tour of Washington State. MOMS exhibitions, all of them, Journey Stories chief among them, are extraordinarily competitive because access to national cultural resources is difficult, and the further out one gets physically, geographically, from hub locations, the more competitive the interest is in exhibits like Journey Stories. So it's quite something that the island was able to secure the exhibit, and we know you'll have a fabulous run with it. The exhibition follows Journey Stories. It follows and chronicles how America settled where it settled. And one of the most special aspects of the exhibit is that it is much amplified and enriched by the stories of the communities in which it resides. So Orcas Island being no exception, You've already had underway some illuminating oral histories and projects with people throughout the island on how it is they came to be on the island. So it is with that in mind that I introduce my two favorite Orcas Islanders, Bill and Valerie Anders. Neither of them need necessarily introduction to this audience because they are very much at home. But I want to just take a moment to say that Bill Anders, who I have artistic license tonight to cite as general, world's greatest pilot, all-around great guy, and Smithsonian supporter, is part of the growth and development of our National Air and Space Museum. He is an enormous source of support and guidance, not just to the Air and Space Museum, but to projects at the Smithsonian, ambitious ones in general, and we are ever grateful to him for what he brought to the nation and for what he brings every day when he helps us in ways large and small. And I'm sure that everyone here will agree that Valerie could very well command a space mission herself. Valerie is a leading member of the Smithsonian's National Board, which is an extremely prestigious group, and she gets our award, the Award of Sites, for being the most level-headed and the most energetic and the most altruistic member of what is quite an august body. She is our ultimate go-to person for wise counsel. She is always there when we need her. And you know what she has done to enrich this island. Quadruple that, and you will have just a small sense of what she does for the Smithsonian. It is our great honor and pleasure to introduce to you our favorite Smithsonian board member and her sometimes better half, Bill and Valerie Anders.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming here to support the Historical Museum, Journey Stories by Smithsonian, and thank you to Bill Buchan for the introduction, and to Anna for, first of all, coming all the way to Orcas Island with Jennifer O'Keefe.
We're not leaving.
Oh, good. And with Aoife Toomey and Michael. We welcome you, and we don't want you to leave. But we have a little journey to tell you about, so I hope we can capture your interest and tell you how it all began. My journey began in San Diego, and I always said my childhood didn't really prepare me for my real life with Bill. That was because I was born in sort of the idyllic place. My parents built a small house in La Mesa, California. They built it with my grandparents, and I grew up in a garden of vegetables and fruit trees and grandparents next door. And at the age of 12, my father was promoted on the California Highway Patrol to sergeant. And we moved to the Mojave Desert, specifically Barstow. Now, I thought this was a big adventure because they had rattlesnakes and cougars, and our house was on a ranch that was situated right between the Santa Fe Rail and Highway 66. And there was a drive-in movie across the street. My brother and I could see it. We couldn't hear it, but it was fun. So my mother was not all that thrilled. So after 6 months, my father was reassigned to San Bernardino for a couple of years. And then we returned to San Diego, where I completed high school and was pretty active as Colonel of the Flag Corps. and then I went to San Diego State for the 1 year before I married Bill.
Well, talk about journeys. Before I was 4, I crossed the Pacific Ocean 3 times on a steamer. My dad was in the South China contingent of the Navy. I was born in Hong Kong, Came back with he and my mother when he was assigned to be a mathematics instructor at the Navy postgraduate school, then at Annapolis. And then he was sent back out to China, this time on what they call the Yangtze River Patrol. Now, have you ever seen the movie Sand Pebbles? That's what they were doing. You might remember that after the Boxer Rebellion, most of the affected European nations grabbed land in China. Portugal, Macau, Britain, Hong Kong, and so on. The United States just reserved the right to patrol their rivers. Seems a little pushy, but nothing compared to some of our colleagues. And so we were, and my mother and I followed up and down the river with the USS Panay. Well, then the Japanese started the Indochina War and the Japanese-Chinese War, and were pressing at the outskirts of Nanking when my mother and dad decided we better get out of there. And so, if you've seen the movie Emperor of the Rising Sun, Empire of the Rising Sun, where the mother is dragging the young boy through the crowd. She trips, he breaks the grip, he disappears into the crowd and spends the rest of the war in a concentration camp with John Malkovich. Of course, the best part of the movie is they had P-51s. Well, my mother didn't trip and didn't let go, and we did make it to the train. And after about 3 days of riding around, it was an empty troop train because all the troops were coming north to Nanking. We made it to Canton. We were bombed by the Japanese. I remember sitting on the porch of a hotel, Japanese light bomber going overhead. It was in the evening, dropping a bomb across the Pearl River. I thought it was great, little kid. And but about that time, we heard that my father's ship had been attacked by the Japanese Army and Army Air Corps. Turns out the Chinese resistance was stronger than the Japanese had anticipated in what is now affectionately known as the Rape of Nanking, and they felt that the American ships standing in the river, notably the Panay, was there just to pick up missionaries and anybody who wanted to ride out, any European, was giving the Chinese too much backbone. So they felt that if they could cause the Americans to lose face, why Nanking would collapse, which basically they were right on that, except that the United States was officially not at war with Japan. So on Sunday morning, right after a late breakfast, the lookout called that there was a squadron of airplanes coming overhead. The captain sent the crew to general quarters, and bomb hit the bridge, took out the captain. My father, who was exec, then was in charge, but he was badly wounded, but still operating. And so he'd gotten shot in the throat, and he took his blood and wrote "open fire" on a navigational chart, which is in the Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. And we think the first American naval officer to order open fire on the Japanese, well before Pearl Harbor. For that, he got the Navy Cross, which was the highest award you could get in peacetime. But in any event, he was taken eventually to San Diego Naval Hospital, try to get cured. He was reassigned to a battleship, and so we moved to Bremerton. And as about 4 or 5, this was just heaven as far as I could remember. So in the summer, must not have been an El Nino year, never rained, all the blackberries you could eat, all the garter snakes you could catch and put in your landlord's fishing boot. He didn't take that too kindly. But in any event, Bremerton was nice, but my dad got complications, went back to San Diego, spent the war there. After he retired, went to Texas. My mother, like Valerie's mother, couldn't take that heat, so we came back to San Diego, where I completed high school and then went into the Naval Academy. And since in those days they didn't have an Air Force Academy, this was way back when, then 25% of both West Point and the Naval Academy could elect to go in the Air Force. And after seeing at least one summer of carrier operations, I decided that 10,000 feet of concrete ahead of me would be a great way to spend my flying career. And so I was commissioned and was married.
And we got married right after his graduation from the Naval Academy and went on our honeymoon to Yosemite in the pup tent and climbed the back of Half Dome, not the front, but up the rope ladder, and did a lot of hiking, and then headed off in August in the new car that Bill's parents had given us as a wedding gift and his graduation gift. It was 55 Pontiac, beautiful car, no air conditioning. Off we went to Texas, to the Rio Grande Valley for pilot training. And we arrived to a cricket epidemic. And in those days I had these petticoats, and all these crickets would get up inside the petticoat. I remember that, going to a movie and having a problem with that. And it was terribly hot. There was no air conditioning in the little place where we were staying. So we joined a pool for $7 a month. And I was swimming along with these huge, what they called water bugs. They were cockroaches doing the side stroke next to me. And I decided it wasn't worth $7 a month. So we quit that club.
Big money in those days.
It was. And then from that first phase of pilot training, we went on to Bryan, Texas, and I enrolled with the first class that accepted women in the summer from Texas A&M. So I'm an Aggie. But they wouldn't let me go on the oceanography boat because I was a woman, and there were no restrooms for women. So I missed out on the tour. And that's where I learned about a couple of things. One, a tornado, which I'd never experienced, hit 1 block away, took out a beer warehouse, hit very close to me.
The Aggies love that.
And what I learned was that when a tornado or a hurricane happens, which we had more of in the future, the pilots flew the planes out and you were left on your own. So I sat on the porch and I watched this thing it was like a huge freight train coming through Bryan and missed us, which was good. And so from there, the third phase of pilot training was in Valdosta, Georgia. And that was never my favorite place. I mean, culturally, politically, every other way. The fact that it had a paper mill that made me nauseated because I was pregnant with our first child. And Bill left it in the morning about 5:30 in the morning and was gone for 13 hours. And the flight surgeon had come and told us that as wives, we were responsible for the welfare of our husbands, and if we didn't feed them breakfast, they might crash.
Listen to that, ladies.
So I got up
Loved
at
it.
4:30 and made his breakfast so he could leave at 5 or whatever it was. And that lasted a little too long for me, but that ended with another long journey across the United States, back to San Diego. And it was the OB doctor said, now you should take no more than 300 miles a day. Well, he said, you got the whole back seat of the Pontiac, we'll just do 750 miles a day. So I had a nice rest in San Diego before going to Hamilton Air Force Base, our first assignment in the Air Force.
So we showed up in San Rafael, California at Hamilton Field, which is a historical World War II and prior place, actually beautiful. The only thing wrong with it, had a very short runway for some of the airplanes they had there, 104s and F-89s and whatnot. But I was flying F-89 Scorpions. These were the Arch Cold War interceptors. They weren't fighters, we like to pretend they were. But they were interceptors which would get out in front of an enemy Soviet bomber fleet and shoot them down before they attacked the cities. And Cold War, for you older folks can remember, was serious business. If we look back at it today, the Russians are better allies than a lot of our friends. Yeah, I say that advisedly. But in those days, it was scary. Bomb shelters in the backyard. We were standing 5-minute alert with heavily armed aircraft, and then 1-hour alert with one version of the F-89 that had 2 nuclear rockets strapped to its wings. These rockets had a range of about 5 miles, 3.5 kiloton yield. The theory was you'd pitch up in front of them because they weren't very fast. You got to get out in front, fire them, take out the whole fleet. You'd become an ace, probably posthumously, but hopefully you could break away before the big explosion got you. But those were serious days, and I actually remember one time when there was a big panic. Dewline went berserk and flying over San Rafael with 2 nuclear rockets, one on each wing, thinking all I got to do is tell the guy in the back seat to throw his switch, I throw mine, and we can blind everybody within 50 miles. But that was Hamilton.
So Hamilton was where our first son was born, Alan was born, and I had just arrived from San Diego when there were signs that I should go to the hospital very quickly and very early. So I called Bill at the squadron, and he came across the highway. We were in base housing, so it was a very short drive, but we only had one car in those days. So he picked me up and dropped me off at Hamilton Air Force Hospital, and I was waiting for him to come in, but he never came in because he said the nurse told him he couldn't come in and he had to go back to the squadron, and it just happened that there was a flight.
Yeah, none of this push stuff in those days.
So 4 hours later, the word went to his squadron that he had a son. Alan was born, and that he should, what was the phrase?
Go afterburner.
Go afterburner
Home plate.
to home plate.
Buster.
And he said, well, why would I do that when I have 2,000 pounds of fuel left?
I've never lived that one down.
I know. So, and then it got me to the point where I realized the responsibility for this child I had just born was pretty much with me, because he said, if this baby wakes me at night, I'll probably crash. So I held that baby for a year because he was a bad sleeper and I didn't want him to cry. And then when our second son came along, Bill was assigned to Keflavik, Iceland, and it was a remote tour, so families couldn't go when you were a first lieutenant. So our second child was born in San Diego, and when he was 4 days old, Bill left for Keflavik, Iceland, and he came back when Glenn was 14 months old. So he didn't know that one very well either. So from Keflavik, Iceland, we had another journey across the United States when he... Okay, it's your turn. You tell us about that.
So I went up to the 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Keflavik, which is on the Reykjanes Peninsula, southwest of the capital, Reykjavik, and it was just one big lava flow. You definitely didn't want to bail out there because it would be a pretty rough landing, like landing on shards of glass. And flying the F-89, again, very reliable, but in horrible weather, chasing Russian bombers, trying to get their number. I can remember one time coming alongside a Bear bomber, actually out over the North Sea, east of Iceland. My wingman was out in case the bomber did anything, he'd take him out. But the 23 millimeter quad 23 millimeter guns followed me in all the way. I came up alongside and expected to see some really hostile faces, and here were these Russians waving and smiling. So what does any guy do? I gave him the bird. And I told Tom Cruise here not long ago that I did it well before he did in Top Gun. One of my colleagues went back about 4 months later, and I won't tell you what sign they had in the window, but it was involved your sister in some serious Russian insult. But then I bought a Volkswagen Bug and met Valerie in New York, and we drove to Hamilton Air Force Base, where I flew the F-101B Voodoo. I think we have another Voodoo driver here. Where are you, Terry? There he is, yeah, Canadian. What Canadian guys did it after we worked all the bugs out of them. They actually, in my view, were not as good an interceptor as the F-89, though they're pretty sexy looking, because the Voodoo had a habit, if you stalled it, it would pitch. It took 15,000 feet to recover it. Not good if you're on base leg. We were there for a little over a year, and I got the itch to either be a test pilot or go to graduate school, and for various reasons graduate school went out to my disappointment, and I was assigned to the master's program in nuclear engineering. I couldn't quite figure out why nuclear engineering. And later I discovered that the Air Force had decided that I might be one of the test pilots for the nuclear-powered airplane, a B-36 flying around with a reactor in it. Very bad idea. And thank God it got canceled.
So we began our bug journey, our Volkswagen bug journey from San Diego right after my brother got married, Alan. Alan was supposed to be the ring bearer, and he was about 3, and he had 2 little things on his wrist, and my mother said he has chicken pox. Well, he didn't get sick at all, but just as soon as we left for Dayton, Glenn came down with terrible chicken pox. He looked like he had leprosy. And we put him in the back of this Volkswagen Bug, and off we went. And by this time, I was 7 months pregnant with Gail. So Bill had rigged a seat so that I could lay the seat down and rest on the way, because we couldn't stop. We had to keep going. And that failed about as we pulled into Dayton, and we figured we had to get Glenn and me to some place where we could recuperate, and the only place we could think of was the bachelor officers' quarters at Wright-Patterson, where you're not supposed to have a family. But we took our Chef Boyardee can and our frying pan, and we had our meals on the floor of the BOQ, and when the bachelor next door wasn't using the bathroom, I'd rush in and wash the spaghetti out and try to keep the fact that we had kids in there from him. We finally found a house and got settled in Dayton, Ohio, and Gail was born a couple months later.
Well, when you graduated,
Then we traded our bug in for, this bug in for a Volkswagen bus. This was the Prairie Schooner, and we installed a twin bed mattress behind the seat, and then Gail, who was 18 months when we left, was put on the back part with a cargo net to keep, she was like a little monkey back there, hanging onto the cargo net. And of course, in those days, you all know, most of you know, that there were no seat belts. These children were floating around inside this Volkswagen bus all the way across the country. And we got as far as we were going from Dayton, Ohio to Albuquerque, New Mexico for his next assignment via Seattle and the World's Fair and San Diego. So the journey was a long one, and we camped all the way with the canned goods pushed under the bed, and we had a little burner. And I remember losing Gail in one campground, and I found her in an old fire pit covered in black coal. My beautiful baby girl.
Just as the sun was going down.
Yeah, just as the sun was going down. That was a panic. And you couldn't wash off this oil because there was only cold water in the camp bathroom, so it was not fun. But finally we made it to the edge of the Tetons, and we were exhausted and it was getting dark, so we just pulled over on the side of a road in a rest stop or something, and it was at about 9,500 feet, so we woke up at 3 with Gail crying in the back, and Bill had made a bunk bed over the front seat for Glenn to sleep over Alan, but in that temperature, the metal failed so that the whole bunk bed and the boy fell down on the other boy. And then nobody would take our turtle when we left Dayton, so the turtle was hanging from the rear view mirror in a little bowl.
The bad net.
In a net.
Swimmer.
The turtle was named Swimmer, and he was frozen, so I put him under my arm to defrost him, and put Gail in the and I put Gail in the bed with me, and then both boys, we just thought there was whore ice all around the inside of this bus, so we decided maybe we better move. Not that the heater in that thing did much good, but it was better than freezing. So we moved on to the next camp. I guess we made it to the World's Fair, and went on to San Diego, and then eventually I took the train with the 3 children and met Bill at Albuquerque, where he was stationed at Kirkland Air Force Base.
Where you had the train.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when she was in the train, besides having kids falling all over and sleeping in the aisle, so the conductor would wake her up and say, "Lady, your little girl's in the aisle." She was pregnant with Greg.
Oh, yeah, I
who,
forgot about that. I was always pregnant.
Every time we moved, there was something about the moving. And Greg just recently retired, to show our age, as a B-52 commander and flying F-15s and A-10 in Iraq for 4 different times. But I was assigned in Albuquerque to the Air Force Special Weapons Center and was lucky not to get a job designing nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon delivery. Not that I wasn't interested in it, but I was assigned to kind of an oddball group called Space Reactors and Shielding, because the Air Force was developing reactors to work in space, and also the shielding associated with space radiation. Well, about a year there, NASA put out a request for the 3rd group of astronauts. And for the first time, they dropped the requirement to be a test pilot. I was coincidentally trying to get into the test pilot school as well. But mainly because of my shielding background and NASA being worried about solar flares, I was actually selected for the 3rd group, and off we went to San Diego and Houston.
Via a few other places. As usual, I was pregnant.
But yet again.
This time it was Eric. And the bad part about this journey was that Volkswagen bus just didn't really have it. And we got to Tacna, Arizona, which is, I can tell you, the middle of nowhere. It is the real desert, the dunes. And that Volkswagen bus failed. And there we were at the side of the road.
At night.
Well, it was getting to be dark. So Bill stood out in the middle of the highway, and he just stood there with his arms out like this and would not move, and a Greyhound bus came that far from him. And it stopped. And so he put me on the bus with Gail and Greg. Greg was about 18 months old. No, he was about 16 months old. So I got on the bus heading to San Diego. It was a 5.5-hour journey. And Greg had some bug and he was sick, and we got to El Centro, and Gail had to go to the bathroom, so I handed Greg to a sailor in the front seat, and I said, "Would you hold my baby? I have to take my little girl to the restroom." And he went. So I took Gail in, and by the time we got back out, the bus was pulling out. So I was running after the bus with Gail, and this sailor was really relieved when I made it back on the bus. So off we went. Bill's father rescued me at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I kept wondering, now, how did I tell him I was coming when we didn't have cell phones? And I don't remember how we did that, but somehow he picked me up. And my brother got a tow bar and went out the next day after he taught school and brought Bill back in the Volkswagen bus, and we had to pay $600 to get it fixed, and that was more money than we had. So let's see, where were we? So then then we took the bus as far as Houston, and I think we finally sold that bus in Houston. Oh, but I was pregnant, and
I had to rest. And
So Eric was born in Houston. About 2 months after we got to the astronaut group, Eric was born there. And we sort of arrived there, and people think about the space program as being this advanced program. Let me tell you, we were truly pioneers, because Lyndon Johnson had decided that the space center should be in that particular place, which happened to be Humble Oil Land between Houston and Galveston. It wasn't really Houston. It was just out there in the middle of nowhere. There were no stores. There were no shoe stores. You couldn't get anything done. There was a general store in Webster with a corrugated tin roof, and it had a few things, but if you wanted anything, you had to drive to Houston 50 minutes away, going 85 miles an hour. And that was the way it was in those days. NASA 1 was called Farm to Market 528. And so we moved in and built a house, and when we built the house, there was a rattlesnake in the driveway the first day we went there, and it was a sign of things to come, because in order to let my children out to play, I often had to kill copperhead, water moccasins, and a coral snake. But the worst was the water snakes, the the non-poisonous ones look like the water moccasin, and I'd heard if you kill a moccasin, it'll smell like a skunk. So one day I had a moccasin about that big around on the front porch, and I took my trusty flat shovel and I got halfway through, and I couldn't get any further, but it smelled like a skunk. So I thought, I've got all these children here. I mean, neighbor children, everybody was there. So I just kept doing it until I finally got that snake. But it was not exactly civilized down there. But we did the thing we could. It was so hot and so humid that the only thing we could do for recreation was to take our kids water skiing on the weekends. When Bill got back from the Cape, he'd be gone all week. He'd come home on Saturday, go to the office. On Sunday, that's what we did. So they became very good water skiers. And then we also had a little sailboat, so we sailed Taylor Lake, which should have been called Mud Lake because the kids had to have typhoid shots to water ski there.
Well, I showed up with this third group, 14 of us. 4 of them were killed in various training accidents while we were there. First thing they did was send us to survival school, although as you heard from Valerie, just being in Houston is a bit of a survival school itself. Though this time we actually afforded air conditioner. But we went to jungle survival, water survival, desert survival. Let me tell you, there's the things they try to tell you in the jungle that are good to eat, it's baloney. And iguana does not taste like chicken, it tastes like iguana. The Apollo 1 fire, which killed the first crew, turned the program kind of upside down. But after survival training, I was assigned to a Gemini 11 backup crew with Neil Armstrong. And Neil and I got along very well. And after the successful Gemini 11 and Gemini 12 flight, they decided to cancel Gemini, and that was, of course, Neil and I were going to fly on Gemini 13. That was the bad news, that we didn't get to fly. But the good news was that both he and I were the first two to check out in this weird lunar landing training vehicle. And let me tell you, that's a whole lecture in itself, but if it hadn't been for that, the lunar landings would not have been successful, because as much as we trained in helicopters on how to do vertical descent and stop, there's no way to simulate the actual 1/6 lunar gravity. And this guy, by computers, and we don't want to get into the details, really made the difference, because it could make you feel like you were actually in a lunar module on the moon. Well, I was assigned to Apollo 8 with Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. This was going to be about the third Apollo flight, and we were going to go into high Earth orbit with a lunar module. I was a lunar module pilot. Thought I had it made for the moon. And unfortunately, the lunar modules were falling behind schedule. Grumman was having trouble. Schedules were slipping. The Russians were making noises like maybe they would go just once around the moon. In fact, they'd sent 2 unmanned but man-capable vehicles around the moon, which really made NASA nervous. So the NASA management made a very bold decision, which we supported. They jumped Apollo 8 one flight earlier, took the lunar module away. That didn't help me much. And made it a lunar orbit flight. And on December 21st, 1968, we launched on the first Saturn V, this huge rocket, 7.5 million pounds of thrust, bigger than a space shuttle and heavier, 6 million pound weight, unbelievable beast. And we spent about an hour and a half in Earth orbit, reignited the upper stage, and in 2.5 days later, we were to the moon, first to leave Earth orbit. Around the moon, we spent 2.5 days getting there, and then on the 4th revolution orbit, we reoriented ourselves, and for the first time, we're treated to this absolutely gorgeous picture of our delicate home planet. over the harsh, unfriendly-looking lunar horizon, and we all grabbed cameras and started clicking away. I just happened to be the lucky guy with a long lens and the color, and machine gunned the Earth, so to speak, clicking and turning f-stops. And so turned out that my picture was the one that NASA selected to put on the forward for the stamp and make the official and now iconic Earthrise picture, which Time Life and the Photography magazine has picked as one of the 10 most influential pictures of the 20th century. We spent 10 orbits in lunar orbit, read from the book of Genesis, not so much as a religious thing, but kind of, sort of give people a blow to the solar plexus, let them know that there was serious stuff going on. Then we reignited our little rocket that we had with us behind the moon, all by ourselves, and 2.5 days later, we re-entered the Earth. Meanwhile, Valerie and the gang were watching, some of them with a little skepticism, Dad re-entering out over Tahiti, 35,000 feet a second, 7 miles a second. That's about here to Bellingham in 2 seconds. 6,000 degrees centigrade on the front of that vehicle. We set 6 world records. There was another one I set personally, but we're not going to that tonight. But we're picked up around Tahiti by the USS Yorktown, the Fighting Lady. Quite a flight, quite an experience.
Quite a journey. So after that all happened, life got really confusing because we were invited to New York for a ticker tape parade and took our 3 oldest children. Greg has never forgiven us for the cutoff being at his level. But we did that and then went on to Chicago for another parade and back to Houston where all the children were in the parade. And then on to...
Well, I started training again.
On to training again.
One of Deke Slayton's books says that he offered Frank Borman the lunar landing. That crew, he didn't take it. I've never brought that up with Frank, but in any event, we didn't go. Jim Lovell and I were made back up on the lunar landing flight, Apollo 11. After that, when I laid banana peels all around the pad and none of the crew would slip on them. So I didn't get to go on that one either. But I was assigned, actually before it was announced, but assigned to the Apollo 13 mission. I thought, well, okay, going to go back around the moon, maybe won't get to land, but at least another flight. But I was offered an opportunity to go to Washington in D.C. And work in the Nixon administration. So off we went. Let's see, we didn't have a Volkswagen. We had by this time we had a real car. I think a Chevrolet station wagon.
Chevrolet station wagon.
And so I was appointed as executive secretary of a thing called the National Aeronautics and Space Council, which was chaired by the vice president, which had actually, under Lyndon Johnson, had proposed the Apollo program to JFK. Lyndon deserves more credit than he gets on that one. And under Agnew, before he got arrested for being a cheap crook, it's bad enough he was a crook, but he was really a cheap crook. Maybe he says something about my ethics. But we started the space shuttle, space station, Viking, and a few other programs. And then when basically we had set the post-Apollo program, I recommended they close that outfit down. And I was appointed by Nixon to the Atomic Energy Commission because of my nuclear background, and surprisingly here I was, 44, made in charge of all nuclear power in the United States, all nuclear power development, including Admiral Rickover. That was an experience for you Navy guys. They decided to break the Atomic Energy Commission into 2 because there was a bit of a conflict of interest between the developers and the regulators, and I wanted to be head of the development part, but Nixon's guys, in their perverse ways, decided they were going to make me head of the regulatory part, which wasn't much fun. Anyway, but important. So I was the chief nuclear judge for over a year, and then my term, I had a short term, And by this time, Nixon had bitten the dust, and Jerry Ford, who was really a good guy, appointed, not because of this, but he did appoint us, Valerie and I, to Norway, where I was the ambassador.
Well, one thing that happened in D.C. is that I was pregnant.
Yet again.
And that was Diana, and there she was, 3 years old. That was when Bill signed. Diana's way up in the corner there, but she was 3 years old when we went to Norway. And
First child.
so that was the first child born to anyone that had been around the moon. So she's Diana.
Only child.
Only child.
That
Goddess of the moon.
anybody will admit to.
Yeah, well, there may be. It's around here. But anyway, she accompanied, she was quite the hit over there because she wore her little Norwegian dress and spoke Norwegian and did the curtsy, and everybody was very, very much in love with Diana at the embassy, so she was an asset. And so then we went on, well, while we were in Washington, I had a very interesting group of friends. It was our sewing group, we called it. And we started out sewing, but then we ended up going to museums and doing various things. Dottie Blackman was the head of this group, and her husband, Harry Blackman, had come to Washington as a Supreme Court justice, and I was actually in the front row with Dottie on the day that Harry Blackman read the Roe versus Wade decision in 1972, which was a momentous thing to see. And so with my sewing group and all the other things, I found Washington, D.C. to be a very interesting place to live. And they even helped me prepare to go to Norway because we really couldn't afford a wardrobe. So they helped me fashion a wardrobe out of various things. And it was a big help to me because we got to Norway and it was a busy time, it was active, it was like having a full-time job. So anyway, that was our experience in Norway.
Yeah,
we did a lot of traveling there and a lot of cross-country skiing with Norwegian friends, which is the way to learn the population, because if you're at a cocktail party and you can't say where you skied during the weekend and what wax you used, you have really very little to talk about.
And one of the pictures